In the space of a single human lifetime, an empire that had ruled for 3 centuries was dismantled and replaced by a state whose authority would reshape the 20th century. The story I tell you now moves through power and failure, faith and ideology, calculation and improvisation. It is the story of a dynasty and its demise, and, in the aftermath, the birth of an entirely different political order. This is the account of the Romanovs' end and how, amid war and civil strife, the Soviet Union rose from the fragments of Imperial Russia. We begin with a question that echoes across generations. How does a regime so vast and so long-lived fail? The answer, as this narrative will show, lies in the gradual erosion of legitimacy, accelerated by catastrophe, and finalized in a moment of irrevocable violence. For much of its history, the Romanov dynasty balanced continuity and adaptation. Emperors and their ministers navigated war, reform, and modernization in fits and starts. By the opening decades of the 20th century, however, the balance had shifted. The Russian Empire was vast and heterogeneous, blessed with resources, but hampered by underdevelopment and an ossified political order. Land remained the principal source of wealth. Rural life dominated social structure. Urbanization and industrialization moved forward unevenly, creating new urban working classes while leaving rural communities politically marginalized. Nicholas II inherited the throne in 1894 at a moment when most European monarchies were eclipsing absolute rule with constitutional forms. Nicholas, however, remained steadfast in his conviction that autocracy was essential to Russia's character and survival. He viewed his office as a moral and sacred trust, not to be compromised for transient political fashions. That conviction made him a man of principle, but crucially, a ruler who misread the pace and depth of social change within his realm. Political movements proliferated during his reign. Liberals sought legal limits on autocracy. Peasants demanded land reform. Industrial workers pressed for conditions and representation. Radical ideologies, Marxist in orientation, populist in practice, found eager adherents among those who saw the imperial state as indifferent or hostile to their grievances. The apparatus of repression, from the secret police to ad hoc military interventions, kept rebellion in check, but also deepened alienation. The symbolism of the monarchy, its pomp, its privileges, its distance from daily hardship, became a target for a society that, in many places, was desperate for change. Russia's military defeats and domestic crises in the first decade of the century exposed the empire's structural weaknesses. The Russo-Japanese War, fought far from the imperial heart, humiliated Russia and weakened confidence in the government's competence. The events of January 1905, bluntly remembered as Bloody Sunday, shattered any remaining faith in the good intentions of autocratic rule for large segments of the population. The Tsar's concession to a Duma, a parliamentary body, was a tactical retreat rather than a transformation. The monarchy maintained the legal prerogatives that kept ultimate power in imperial hands. Over time, the gap between formal institutions and public expectations widened until trust was no longer repairable through incremental reform. World War I was the catalyst that brought accumulated weaknesses into crisis. The war exposed deficits in infrastructure, logistics, industrial production, and perhaps most damagingly, in the political relationship between ruler and ruled. At first, patriotic fervour swept many Russians into a kind of collective commitment, but the Russian war effort faltered. Casualty lists mounted, supply lines buckled, and the economic burdens of a continental war, food shortages, inflation, and the suspension of normal life became a daily reality for millions. Nicholas II's decision to assume supreme command of the armed forces in 1915 was intended to rally the nation and to give the monarch direct control of the war effort. Instead, It removed him from the capital and positioned him personally to be held accountable for every military failure. Power, in practice, fell to the imperial household. Empress Alexandra, following her husband's departure, exercised increasing influence over governance. Her dependence on the mystic Grigory Rasputin, his purported ability to aid the Tsar's haemophiliac heir, became a source of scandal, eroded the veneer of rational administration. Rasputin's influence, real or imagined, came to symbolize the monarchy's detachment and its susceptibility to irrationality. By 1917, Petrograd and other cities were scenes of sustained strike action, lines outside bakeries and shops, and popular demonstrations that were no longer easily contained. The combination of military catastrophe and economic collapse dissolved the loyalty of whole swaths of the armed forces. Soldiers mutinied. Garrison loyalties shifted. When the protests of February to March by the modern calendar erupted, the institutions that should have defended the regime refused to operate as before. Within a matter of days, the imperial government was incapacitated. Nicholas II abdicated, formally ending Romanov autocracy. His abdication did not usher in immediate stability. It created a vacuum filled by provisional authority and competing visions of Russia's future. The political interregnum that followed the Tsar's fall was precarious. The provisional government, led first by liberal figures and later by moderate socialists, promised constitutional reform and elections. It also made the fateful decision to remain in World War I. That choice alienated soldiers and civilians alike, who saw peace as essential to survival and recovery. The provisional government's authority was further undermined by the existence of Soviets, workers' councils, across the major urban centres, particularly the Petrograd Soviet. Power, therefore, became dual. Legal authority claimed by ministers, and de facto social authority exercised by councils and popular committees. Into this volatile landscape returned Vladimir Ilyich Lenin, who had been in exile. Lenin's analysis of the moment was straightforward and resolute. The provisional order had failed the masses. The revolutionary opportunity was immediate. His rallying cry, peace, land, bread, spoke directly to the needs of soldiers, peasants, and workers. The Bolshevik Party, once a faction of Russian socialism, rapidly became an instrument of disciplined revolutionary action under Lenin's leadership. In October of 1917, the Bolsheviks seized control of key points in Petrograd. Equipment and facilities were taken with minimal bloodshed in the capital, though military and political conflict would follow elsewhere. What followed was not a stable transfer of power, but the opening act of an exceptionally brutal civil war. The Red Army, organized under Bolshevik command and later led by figures such as Leon Trotsky, contended with a fragmented white opposition, monarchists whose loyalties lay with the old order, liberal nationalists seeking a different constitutional form, and regional forces seeking autonomy or advantage. The Allies, Britain, France, the United States, and Japan, provided varying levels of support to anti-Bolshevik forces, though their interventions were inconsistent and often self-interested. The civil war ground across the breadth of the former empire. It was a conflict of ideology and survival, of local grievances and grand strategy. The methods of warfare hardened. Both sides committed atrocities. The Bolsheviks employed a centralized apparatus of political policing, summary justice, and requisitioning to secure urban food supplies and raw materials. The whites relied on coercion and sometimes turned to reactionary violence that alienated broad segments of the population. In the vacuum of legal order, hunger and disease spread. By the war's end, the social fabric in many regions was shredded. Entire communities had been displaced or destroyed. The very scale of destruction made the option of compromise more remote. A decisive outcome, however terrible, seemed inevitable. The Romanov family's personal trajectory through these tumultuous years was both tragic and deeply symbolic. Removed from power and placed under house arrest, Tsar Nicholas II and his immediate family were first held in a remote Urals town and later confined to the Apatiev house in Yekaterinburg. Their captivity took place against a backdrop of military maneuvers, conspiracies, and the practical fear among Bolshevik authorities that the Romanovs might become a rallying symbol for anti-Bolshevik forces advancing in the region. On the night of July 16th to the early morning of the 17th, 1918, an extraordinary and irreversible decision was executed. The local Ural Soviet, acting in consultation with Bolshevik leaders who believed that the survival of their government required the permanent removal of the monarchy's symbolic presence, ordered the execution of Nicholas II, his wife Alexandra, their 5 children, and 4 attendants. They were taken into a basement room in the Apatiev house and killed. The execution was carried out rapidly and without the pretense of a judicial process. For contemporaries abroad and at home, the event's shock value was enormous. Allied monarchies and conservative circles expressed horror and indignation. Among revolutionary supporters, reactions ranged from quiet approval to unease at the method. Practically, the killing eliminated the possibility that the Romanovs could be used as a living focus for counter-revolutionary mobilization. Symbolically, it severed a line that had been the visible spine of imperial legitimacy for more than 2 centuries. It is important to note the complexity of responsibility for the act. The decision emerged from a chain of local fears, military realities, and political calculations. It was not simply an act of blind cruelty, but a deliberate, if brutal, political choice in the context of civil war. Whether that choice was necessary, justified, or monstrous is a matter of moral and historical judgment, an argument that historians continue to debate. What is indisputable is that the execution of the Romanovs signaled an absolute break with the old order, and it marked, in the minds of many, a point of no return. With the elimination of the Romanov dynasty and the military defeat of many white forces, the Bolsheviks began the work of consolidating power and of constructing the institutional framework of a new polity. That task was neither immediate nor linear. The early post-war years were dominated by economic collapse, famine, and political repression. To stabilize the economy, the Bolshevik leadership introduced the new economic policy in 1921, a pragmatic retreat that allowed limited private enterprise and small-scale market activity, while the state retained control over strategic industry and banking. Politically, however, the revolution's aims remained radical. The Bolsheviks sought to supplant class hierarchies and to reorganize economic life along collectivist lines. The centralization of political power in the Communist Party and the creation of a command economy undercut pluralistic institutions. Lenin's own praxis reflected a blend of ideological aspiration and ruthless expedience. Revolutionary aims could not be realized without the instruments of centralized control. In 1922, a formal structure emerged: the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. The USSR was conceived as a federation of republics that recognized national particularities while integrating them into a centralized administrative and economic apparatus. The founding of the Soviet Union institutionalized the revolutionary gains and created a polity with ambitions that reached beyond its borders. It presented itself as an alternative modernity, promising industrialization, literacy, and social services on an unprecedented scale, while demanding political conformity and the suppression of organized dissent. Joseph Stalin's ascent after Lenin's death in 1924 dramatically altered the trajectory of the Soviet state. Under Stalin, ideological goals were fused to an acceleration of industrialization and a coercive campaign of collectivization. The human cost was immense. Peasant resistance, forced grain requisitions, and famines produced millions of deaths and the ruination of rural society. The authoritarian core of the Soviet system tightened, with purges and show trials eliminating rivals and instilling a culture of fear that permeated the party and the society it governed. Despite this violence, the Soviet Union consolidated itself as a major state with industrial capacity and military potential. By mid-century, it would confront and compete with the West on political, ideological, and military terms. The metamorphosis from empire to authoritarian socialist superpower was brutal, uneven, and historically consequential. A century after the Romanovs' deaths, their place in Russian and global memory remains contested. The Soviet era cast the dynasty as an emblem of feudal oppression. The revolution was presented as liberation. With the Soviet Union's collapse in 1991, Russia's relationship to its imperial past entered a new phase of reassessment. Public ceremonies, rehabilitations, and renewed interest in the Romanovs' personal lives reflected a broader cultural negotiation about identity, legitimacy, and national narrative. In the late 20th century, efforts to recover and identify the murdered family's remains reopened wounds and sparked debates. For some, the reburial of identified remains in St. Petersburg signified a closure and a respectful acknowledgement of tragedy. For others, the Romanovs' deaths remained inseparable from the revolutionary violence that had toppled an unequal regime. The Orthodox Church's later canonization of the family as martyrs added another layer of symbolic meaning, religious interpretation interwoven with historical memory. The transition from empire to Soviet state was neither simple nor inevitable. It contained elements of popular aspiration, revolutionary logic, geopolitical upheaval, and tragic human choice. The end of the Romanov line was a pivotal moment, but it was one node in a larger sequence of events that transformed society, governance, and global affairs. The Soviet experiment reshaped the modern world, producing achievements in science, education, and industrialization, while also leaving behind a legacy of repression and human suffering. As we close, consider this. History resists singular moral verdicts. The fall of the Romanovs and the rise of the Soviet Union produced heroes and villains, victims and perpetrators, progress and catastrophe. To tell the story without simplification is to accept ambiguity, that great political projects may arise from genuine grievances, that the pursuit of utopia often yields unforeseen violence, and that symbols, crowns or flags, can both unite and divide. For students of history, the lesson is twofold: to understand the long causes that make revolutions possible, and to reckon honestly with the short decisions that determine how they unfold. As we close this chapter of history, the story of the Romanovs and the rise of the Soviet Union reminds us how swiftly the tides of power can turn and how deeply those choices shape the world we inherit today. If you found this exploration insightful, consider supporting the channel by giving this video a like. It helps us reach more people who are passionate about history. Subscribe and turn on notifications so you won't miss our next deep dive into the moments that changed the course of nations. And I'd love to hear your thoughts. Was the fall of the Romanovs inevitable, or could Russia have taken a different path? Share your insights in the comments below. Let's start a conversation. Thank you for watching, and until next time, keep seeking the stories that shaped our world.